Hello and welcome to episode 12 of the Testing Peers podcast. Tonight we're going to be talking about when enough testing is enough, deciding when the right time is to stop on our testing. I'm joined as always by David.
Hello.
Chris.
Hiya.
Russell.
Hello.
And it's me, Simon. This podcast is kindly sponsored by Saffron QA. Saffron QA is a provider of recruitment and consultancy services exclusively for the software testing industry. More details can be found in the show notes. Chris, what wonderful thoughts have you got for us tonight?
Enough is enough, right? And you can tell me to shut up because that'll be enough. So I was talking today with an old colleague from back in my computer game days. And during my lunch times when I worked there, I used to play the classic WWE Raw versus SmackDown or SmackDown versus Raw games with a bunch of colleagues pretty much during the entire break. And it was so much fun. We came up with like our own storylines with our own characters. We tried to have a bit of fun. But there's always someone who takes it a little bit too seriously. People that care too much about wins and losses and things. And you might notice that with any sort of competition that maybe you've had in the workplace with things. I was just wondering if maybe you had any examples of things where somebody's maybe taken things a little bit too far, maybe seriously. Maybe a board game with Monopoly or something.
What, work colleagues or
Anything.
Just generally?
It can be work, it can be home. Maybe you flipped off, David.
I do tend to like games and stick to the rules. I don't like to break away to a certain extent when I'm playing games. However, it's fun. It's interesting actually because we do quizzes at work, and we have done, and I've been on two teams where I have absolutely known the answer, and because someone was insistent, I let them, knowing it was wrong, go with their answer. We often lost by 1 or 2 points, which I was then kicking myself as I should have been a bit more sort of.
I had an argument with a radio DJ that he was a local radio DJ at my old work, and it was about what year Hanson released Mbop. And that was in a pub quiz. I'd just like to point out that I clearly knew when it was because I bought it as a single, obviously.
Of course you did. Never doubted it.
That doesn't surprise me.
It came out in 98. He was mad.
When did it come out, Chris?
It was 97, I think, or 96. It definitely wasn't 98. That much I knew. It's a great anecdote.
It's fantastic.
How about you, Simon? When have you? I bet you've lost your marbles a few times, haven't you?
I think having kids to an age where they play games with you now has kind of mellowed me a bit with games. Because I used to be a real stickler, like David said, a real stickler for the rules when you play things like Monopoly or anything like that. And playing kids Monopoly has taught me to let it go sometimes. Not everyone needs to pay the exact fines at the exact times and all that kind of stuff. So, yeah, I definitely think kids have mellowed my game playing.
My mum used to take overdrafts in Monopoly. She'd get a bit of paper and go, "I'm just going to borrow £2,000 from the bank." And we're like, "What?"
It's amazing all the family rules that sort of come.
Yeah. But also, you can't be ultra competitive dad and just win everything, and the kids just sit in the car.
Yeah, it's the same with like sports in the garden as well. I mean, my oldest has started liking to play football in the garden, and I'm having to not score too many goals because he gets upset if he starts losing. So it's trying to find that balance between teaching them about competitive sport and letting them win.
Yes, I always remember going to a bowling alley with my daughter, and it was one of these older style ones where you either had the bumpers up or the bumpers down. So we had to have the bumpers up for the whole time. And because of that, I then beat my daughter. My wife told me off for, why didn't you give her a chance? I was trying to give her a chance, but I had to have the bumpers up. So therefore, I just happened to knock a few more down than she did.
Talking of competitive video games, in the house I lived in my last year at uni, there was 8 of us in the house. And the 4 of the guys liked playing FIFA every night from about 10 when we come back from the pub till about 2-3 in the morning, most nights of the week. And we always did doubles. That was 2 against 2, and we picked teams. And we ended up creating our own strikers. So we created ourselves as strikers. And the competitive part of me made sure that my striker weighed the heaviest weight it could weigh so that defenders couldn't push me off the ball. so that there was always this almost competitive thing that I was guaranteed to win the header in the corners because my striker was the heaviest you could be. It was like having Akin Fenwar in the middle of your penalty box, and no one can knock him off the ball. And that was my ultra competitive bit. It didn't really do me any good longer term, but it was fun for the weeks and months that we played FIFA every single night without fail. FIFA 2005, if any of you are interested.
We had this with the Raw versus SmackDown or SmackDown versus Raw. I think it's SmackDown versus Raw, isn't it? When we played that, there were some people that would they'd be able to exploit some of the little bits in the game, or they'd always choose to be a certain character. It's like if you chose to be Oddjob in GoldenEye, because Oddjob was so much lower that a normal headshot would miss them and things like that.
I had similar things with SmackDown versus Raw because my friends were not wrestling fanatics like I was. They insisted I had to be Rey Mysterio so they could be the big guys and I could be little guys, not realizing that because I knew how to play it didn't matter.
It's interesting how people take things so seriously. I have a habit of only taking things to the point where I get upset if it's going wrong. If I actually think I should win, but I'm quite good at not thinking I'm going to win. And actually, I quite often take a bit of enjoyment out of just enjoying playing a game. So like I'm playing Risk. I've picked somebody that I'd quite like to only battle with them. So even if I've got a mission to take over sort of 2 or 3 continents, I'm like, I'm just gonna try and fight you, just because it's quite fun, just to be a bit stupid. I'm quite good at being quite stupid. Different kind of strategy, deviating a little bit.
So linking to the topic of today of when is enough enough, Simon, with your evening of playing computer games and or thinking about sort of Monopoly that can drag on for long enough, when do you consider enough is enough and it's time for bed or time to pack up?
Well, the FIFA side is always difficult because it'd be like just one more game, one more game.
You're students, you don't sleep. It's fine.
Exactly.
One more beer.
Not at night time anyway.
With the Monopoly, you do sometimes get to the point where it's like it's been on 3 or 4 hours. Like I'm just going to count my money now. I'm done. Yeah. Let's just count money and see how we're doing. I've never really had a particular rule to stick by that's it. We're going to stop now. I guess actually with the kids Monopoly, it's usually because there's only 4 of us and we just wait till every property has been bought.
Yeah.
And once every property's been bought, we then say, okay, everyone's got something now. Let's see who's the winner. It's usually my eldest son.
Because also it depends. It depends with the Monopoly as to whether people want to negotiate. Because actually you can get to a point in the game where it just becomes a bit boring for a bit.
I have a lot of fun with negotiations.
I bet you do.
My mum walked away from the table.
We played at my wife's family a few years ago at Christmas, and I think all the girls were out quite early because they got bored of it, and there was just the 3 guys left, my father-in-law and my brother-in-law and me, and it dragged on, and they were just chief negotiators. They just wanted to negotiate everything and push everything, and it's just you know what, I'm done. It's not really knowing the limit until you hit it, until you're physically, mentally like, you know what, actually I'm done now.
It's a feeling. It's a reading of the room, isn't it? You either feel like I'm done or I'm not enjoying this anymore. Like the purpose of me doing this is no longer purposeful.
Yeah.
Or if you can see someone's getting riled either by what you're doing or what someone else is doing, that's normally a point at which you say enough.
Or the kids aren't concentrating and starting to TikTok and.
That's after about 5 minutes. Kids don't pay attention.
Actually, we had a thing. We read the room quite well. We had some friends over for New Year's last year, when we were allowed to have friends over, that kind of thing. And we played Cards Against Humanity. And for the first hour or so, everyone's absolutely guffawing with laughter at the cards that are being drawn and the scenarios that are coming up. But after about an hour and a half, you're starting to think, this is not funny anymore. You kind of need to just stop and play it again another time. It'll be funny again. But actually, we've got to a point where the humour had dried up. We'd started to sort of get to a point where it was just becoming silly little cards rather than sort of good combinations. And it's like, we're stopping now.
So, guys, let you be real with me. Just between you and me. When we're testing, when we're questioning, when is enough enough? When do you stop? Where do you draw the line? Do you have your own limits, or do you just wait till time runs out? What about if you execute all of your test cases?
I think this depends on the context, because the way I've seen it in waterfall projects or very traditional projects is they will define all the test cases they want to build, and they will say, right, we're finished when we've done all these test cases. But
there's a lot of work. There's a lot of work to generate that list. So
Yes.
When have you done? When have you exhausted that enough?
Well, this is the thing. It depends on the setup. But if the people that are writing the tests are the same ones that run the tests, which isn't always the case, sometimes you get specific people that script them and other people that execute them. So it's in the head of that one person and two people that are writing the scripts, that they're all the scripts we need to write. There may be the odd one here and there that people that are executing it execute them. They find cases that have been missed and they write them in. But particularly in quite regulated contexts where I was previously, you had a specific number of test cases that you defined at the start. If you then had more test cases or the number was different to what you specified at the start, that became a problem. So you had to try and get as smart at the start on how many test cases you defined and make sure that you execute all of them at the end. Now, obviously, my preference is not to have that kind of contextual issue, and that actually, yes, you're right, it becomes more of a blurry line of when have we done enough testing? And for me, it's always been a risk-based thing of when have we mitigated enough risk to feel comfortable that if we were to release now, we'd be happy. And again, that comes down to, have we tested enough areas of the system to feel confident that it works? And if we decided to press the button now, how would we feel?
Yeah, I'd agree with that. It's context driven. The company I work for, I always say it depends on the project because we work on so many different projects. There are lots of different factors that can affect the testing. Obviously, the triangle, whatever, time, money. And if you had as much time in the world, then obviously you'd look at other things. And I agree, risk. Also, you might have entry or exit criteria about the number of, priority 1 bugs or whatever not being there. So it is based on the context, and it's a discussion for every particular project as to what those things are. And because people's perception of when enough is enough, as we discussed before, mentioned before, quality. If that's the main thing they're looking for, it's the perception of quality as to when they are happy with the product that you're producing. So it's not actually a question of when with testing is enough. When is the quality of the product good enough for the client or whoever?
Do you think a lot of that has something to do with your releases as well? Because if you are the kind of organization that can release all of the time, and you can be very reactive, take customer feedback and be sort of iterative in the way you do things, your attitude towards what is enough now is different to if you're in that traditional model where it's kind of, you are done. Once this is released, it is public, and that is it. Like the computer games world pre-online gaming was completely that way. We had a hard cut date. That's why we worked 120 hours overtime in a month. You had that hard cut-off time. You had to hit that deadline because when that was done, you had to try and have covered as much of that delicious matrix that you had for testing as you possibly could do. You had to try and cover absolutely everything. I mean, I'd never even heard of the term edge case in those days. It was you cover flipping everything. They said every one person in that seat had to be representative of 1,000 users, if not more. In that context, it was definitely, there is a tick sheet of every single variable that is possible in this ginormous thing. And in that context, I did not feel confident. I did not feel happy with the work that I was doing. I did not have creativity. I didn't get to make choices about what the end user may want to do. And maybe I didn't have any right to feel that way, but there certainly was no idea of tests being involved in the early discussions. When we talk about risk-based stuff, we want that risk-based stuff at the very beginning, right? We want those conversations as we start. That's why we talk things like risk storming with product managers and things like that at kickoff. And that's when we define what's in and out of scope, hopefully. That wasn't the case in that old model. And sometimes I'm surprised that I'm still here because that's what I had lived in for so many years. But it's a gut feeling, right? You talk about confidence, because I can feel like a release is coming, and I know bad things are going to happen. And so what do you do if you don't think enough is covered, but that deadline can't be moved? That's another question that probably we might well have come across.
Yeah, that is true. And I've definitely been in scenarios where that's been the case, where I've gathered everything I can from the team that have been doing the testing along with their own testing I've been doing myself, and push back that there's no way we can be happy with this date. The only way we're going to be happy with this date, it's not amount of it's not a case of putting the hours into run extra tests. There are fundamental things we're concerned about. This does not work in the way we feel it needs to work, or there's things missing. And that comes down to a process problem, usually, because it comes down to the fact that either testing were involved too late or the deadline was unrealistic from the start. And actually, we'll try to do as much as we can, but we're coming closer to the deadline and it's not feasible. I think, the obvious answer is you can never exhaust the amount of testing you're doing. There is always more you can do in possible every scenario. That you're never going to reach 100% test coverage. There's always going to be those 3 or 4 scenarios, maybe more, not thought about, that nobody's thought about, that actually won't happen until it gets out in the field because of different configuration setups, whatever else, or different people take different paths. But it's a case of going with, like you say, your gut feel and trying to prove that you've done enough testing to cover the main risks. And I always come back to risk because for me, risks are the most important. As long as you're covering the functionality and you've mitigated the risks of the what if this goes live and it blows up in the customer's face, then you have to have some level of confidence that you're taking a small risk by releasing earlier than we've covered all the testing we could do. For me, it always comes back down to that balance of risk and features being covered.
Yeah, I'd agree. I guess the tester's skill is knowing that risk analysis, working with the stakeholders, as you mentioned, to use the techniques of testers in order to figure out the risks, decide which tests need to be executed, which ones are critical versus nice to haves, using their skills, their judgment, their knowledge of the technologies, the knowledge of the frameworks in use, the knowledge of the customer, the knowledge of the stakeholders. The sort of risks that we've got, you've got the feature working, you've got regression, security, you've got performance, you've got usability, you've got all those different sort of aspects that we have to kind of balance. And we can use our gut. I think gut is definitely plays a part. Subconsciousness plays a part of it, but we do use a lot of formal techniques more often than not. Exploratory testing is a technique that we use to try and mitigate that risk. Once we do a lot of the mitigation, that balancing point, that which side of the line you fall upon, is it enough or not? That's probably the final decision, is based upon you feeling that you've covered those risks appropriately. We don't often have formal risk registers with all the test cases as risks. Whether this test fails, does it mean we can't ship? We generally don't go that length, but yeah, it does end up coming down to kind of that, assessing what we've done. Is there anything else we should do, would do? And the other risk is obviously, are there any bugs? Is there any rework to be done?
And you're right, actually, Russell. There's a good point there that it's often not thought about that every test case you run is mitigating some kind of risk. Running that test case or not is a risk to the overall solution. And if that statement was made to the PMs or the delivery managers that were putting the project together at the start, they would literally go into, their head would go on fire and they'd just think, well, we have to run every single test case. Which is why it's also important that it comes back to the sharing information and communicating quality, is you make sure you communicate enough information to the people that need to know, but you don't necessarily tell them everything, because if you tell them there's test cases that we're not going to run because they're not important, somebody will have an issue with that. Somebody will be concerned that we're missing something, that we need to run everything. And I've certainly been in the situation, as Chris mentioned, in the gaming world. I was in the same in the antivirus cybersecurity world, where if you made a call that we weren't going to cover this particular combination, somebody would have an absolute issue with the fact that we were not going to run that. Whether it was a 1% risk of prevalence in the field that user would have that particular setup, or whatever, there would be somebody that thinks this could cost us millions if it goes wrong. So we have to test everything. And yeah, go on, Russell. I was
going to say, I always find that a bit weird, because it depends who came up with it. The same person who came up with that idea of that test then says, no, we don't necessarily need to run this test. My head goes, well, the person who thought of it decided the risk isn't strong enough to require the mitigation they proposed.
Yeah, no, you're right, and that's why it comes into another conversation we have about peer reviews. And there was always these cases of reviewing the testing to try and, if there is a hard and fast deadline, you do review your tests to try and see what don't we need to run, what can we get away with running and still be confident, and that would be those kind of discussions.
Do we talk just about test cases, or are we actually talking about different ways of testing? Because, we could say we're doing this much time is going to spend penetrating testing, this time this is going to be doing security testing or load testing, functional or non-functional, blah, 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 blah. It's how that is put together is probably very different, as you say, to how that is presented to people that aren't necessarily doing the work, because in reality, they probably don't want to know the granular detail of that which you're doing. They just want to know that the work has been done. Your skills have been applied to actually gaining that confidence and being able to feel like they can go live with whatever this is because they trust you. And it's a trust thing, right? Because if some people only trust numbers rather than the people, I think you've got a much deeper problem.
Absolutely. Yeah, and this is something that I've always had this idealistic view of how I think I could present it in a way that makes people feel comfortable, and I've never been able to manage it yet. And this is something I'll probably continue working on. But I've always thought it's a visual thing of almost having a visualization of the system and showing the workflows that we're going to cover through the system as part of our testing, so that people can clearly see where we're testing and where we're not, rather than doing it at a test case level, looking at the overall scenario, the user stories, the user journeys of the system that we're going to cover. It will clearly show them where it's not coloured in, which areas won't be covered, etc., etc. And we can have the discussions around the risk of those areas. Sounds simplistic enough, but for some reason I've never actually managed to find a way that works. It's a plea out there if someone's got a way.
Because it's quite complicated. It's a large project.
Yes, it is, absolutely.
Every system's different, and you can't just get static code analysis or unit code coverage and things like that. They are,
and those tools have limits as well. Those tools, they don't cover absolutely everything.
How much do you trust it when a developer tells you that it's just a small change in this area, it doesn't affect that?
The opposite.
I've got a good example. I was in a meeting just before we started testing or a particular phase, and so we had everyone there, and so just as an offcut, your last 5 minutes, I just said, so what are the priorities of this? What has anything else that I need to test? And one developer went, I've just made one small tweak to this particular bit of code. And then we discussed it, and we realized that the small level amount of regression testing that they were planning suddenly ballooned because of this one small change into so many different areas. So the scope of the testing suddenly became so much more of a problem for the time frame for which they wanted for the testing, just because a developer had slipped in a small change.
And that's where I think testers can really prove their value in those situations as well, because if we have an idea of the overall system impact of those changes, yes, we don't necessarily need to know every line of code, but if we understand the code enough to be able to say, well, you make a change there, it's going to impact this area over here. And if the developer hasn't thought about it, having that other person that can challenge it is useful. And other developers might do it. But I think from a testing perspective, we need to have that ability to see the overall picture holistically.
You probably want that with your developers actually viewing your tests as well.
Absolutely.
If you've got a test that you've written, they can actually see where that could be enhanced, where that could touch other bits of code. Or this would be a good test to have against this change that I'm doing. It works both ways.
Well, they can tell you they don't need that test because they've got unit tests for it or something else that covers it, and so on and so forth. But no, I think getting devs to kind of tell you about the changes is a really good technique in general. The amount of times I've had to get a kind of small change come, yes, it's one line change. Okay, what uses that bit of code? And ask the developers to tell me. And they went and looked, and they went, oh yeah, this thing. Oh yeah, you don't want to touch that thing. That's horrible. Yeah, do we really want to change that line of code then? Yeah, I'll do it a different way. And it's triggered events and conversations, and ultimately it comes down to that. It's conversations.
Yeah, I
Never
agree.
take anything at face value. Always ask, what does it impact? And if they tell you it's a completely unique bit of code that just displays a header on one page only, not used by anywhere else, and they've checked, I'll have a bit more trust in them.
But again, it's mitigating the risk. It all goes back to risk, doesn't it?
It does.
Definitely. We're at the top level, so it's looking at the whole system, but we can drive down to see, what is the effect of that particular one change.
Yeah, and it's all about the things you've got in place to automatically catch it, the unit test, the automated test, the performance test, the usability scanning, or whatever you've got in place. Chris talked about sort of more CD world, where you do a small change, release it instantly. And, you've got monitoring in place for that sort of DevOps world. You've got other things. You can take a lot of automation, a lot of things to give you a good picture, whether you've broken anything important. Does that make sense? But generally, you operate different layers at different stages of that deployment cycle. Again, you've got different risk profiles. And again, depending what you change, depends what you do. If you upgraded the entire, Ruby version, the application was on, you'd probably do quite a lot more than if you just changed spelling error in a static bit of text. But, those sort of rapid roll back, rapid roll forward sort of environments do change that risk profile, because you can accept slightly more risk, I would argue, than the deploys that are once a year. Well, a lot more.
Yeah,
risk
I
than
agree.
deploys
I
once a year.
agree, and certainly coming from a model like a bit like Chris, where we did a yearly release, a yearly major version release. Anyway, everything was pushed towards that major version release date, and you had to make sure that everything was fixed. And there was a couple of times where we've realised too late that there was a problem, and we were still going to go ahead and release that major version, but we're going to have to do a very quickly release a minor version straight afterwards, because we'd finished all the testing. There was like a month left, and the release process took forever because of the amount of things that had to be done, CDs being created and whatever else. That the testing was finished, but there's nothing we could do about it unless we wanted to delay the release. We're going to go with it. We're going to put another release out.
I was going to pick up on a couple of points from earlier. So we mentioned about time, and that testing will always be done to fill whatever time is available, I think is quite a good thing. And also, I think Russell mentioned about, and also Chris, about the types of testing. Another thing to get testing early is to recognize the scope of the testing, where they might not have thought about security or penetration or, and all the different types of testing. And a third point I was going to say was that also with PMs and the management, they need to understand the scope of the testing. So, it's all right having these modern exploratory BDD and that stuff. They might not necessarily know that. And as soon as they hear something new, they ka-ching, it's going to cost us so much more money because we're doing things in a different way, and I'm not comfortable or confident that you're going to get the results. So again, it's a selling thing to sell them that actually we can use all these methods. We know what these methods are, and we know what the results are.
It feels like everything we've been talking about so far is captured beautifully in that one-page test plan.
So what is the one-page test plan?
Dun, dun, dun. I came across it thanks to the Ministry of Testing website. It's been plugged by a lot of people, but basically it's you split into a whiteboard, if you can, a real life one with real people around you, into 6 segments. You have your sort of basic project or feature introduction stage. Then you have your in scope stage, your out of scope stage. I'm calling it stages, it's just an area. You list your risks and assumptions, your resources and timescales, and your environments and tools. And basically, everyone throws stuff on there, and you get everyone, because everyone's doing it at the same time. If somebody puts something up that's wrong, somebody will point that out and say, "Oh no, that's wrong." If something's missed, you'll get it on there, and it's a way of sort of putting it onto one page, getting everybody on the project onto one page what you're doing. So because especially on, say, a short-term project like a 1 sprint project that I've got now, there's no room to waste time on something that's out of scope. We need to have a lot of focus on exactly what we're doing, but also why, who the people are, who the stakeholders are, what tools we've got and environments. And the list of risks and assumptions are really important to get to the stakeholders immediately, because as and when you find problems or decisions to be made, you can say, this is already up front what we've agreed.
I've never used it in that way, but it sounds like a good way of using it.
It's such a good conversation. So I had our test lead, 2 BAs, 1 for each project. I had a different stakeholder who's never done anything like this before, intending, he was from like commercial team, and then a project manager, and I explained what the 6 areas were like, and I just said, put stuff in, even if it's a question. So you're not definitively saying it's in this in scope. You put something in and say, is this in scope? And then afterwards, you collate the information, then you circulate it amongst the most important people. Say, this is our understanding, these are our questions. These are the things that they are interested in. They're not really interested in the environments that you're using. They're not really interested in the people who are involved or the tools that you're going to be using. They are interested in what you think is in scope, what you think is out of scope, and what your risks and assumptions are. So those 4 bits for stakeholders are the most important parts. But for us as the ones who are doing the work, the information, the documentation, who's involved, who the stakeholders are, how to contact them, and where we intend to do the work is the most important part for us. It's not the most important part, but that's important for us. It's like, when you've got documentation, not everything is needed for everybody. But it's a really good way, I think, of having a conversation quickly about something rather than getting a whole bunch of requirements, going away, mapping test cases or whatever against them, creating this one huge document that you're going to reference once in your life that you've spent, half a day to an entire day writing, and then in 3 weeks' time, it's no longer relevant because the project's gone.
Okay. So the way we've done them is similar to similar. So we've done them as a project kickoff sort of thing, just to write down the high level project assumptions, project scope, the high level stuff to get the testers on a project on the same page. We shared it with stakeholders. Generally, questions get answered. If there's questions, as Chris said, on the scope side of things, then it draws them out. But it's generally very, very high level.
It doesn't have to be granular. Again, it depends on the scope of the project, doesn't it? Like this is a 3-week project, so
like Chris, it's you get the heads that are relevant and get them to fill it in. And we didn't use whiteboards. We just used it was a Google Sheets, in fact. Just one sheet on Google, because people in different offices just fill it in.
As long as it's a collaborative tool, I guess that works. We use Miro.
Okay. Yeah. But this idea, rather than writing huge test plans and documentations, just throw the key things that really matter onto a piece of paper.
Sounds like it works well with Agile.
Yes.
Not quite so well with that V model, but certainly with Agile.
It depends on what you define as Agile, David. I mean, let's be honest.
we all know that Agile can be interpreted in many different ways.
Oh, and it is.
It's a wonderful little tool. Kudos.
Claire Reckless, I think it was, wasn't it?
Rings a bell.
Ding ding. Yes, Claire Reckless. A very, very worthy shout out for Claire Reckless as one-page test.
Yes.
Do you have a link to that one-page test plan, Chris? Could it be put in the show notes?
I will check with my my personal assistant who raises our podcast onto the internet, Mr. Russell Cracksford, and see if he can hook us up with a link.
Put it in the blog post.
I'm sure we can.
Yes. We know as the testing peers when enough is enough for this particular episode. We value any feedback that you'd like to give us on this particular episode or any others. You can contact us via Twitter @testingpeers or by email at contactus@testingpeers.com, or you can support our efforts through these podcasts through the Patreon site at patreon.com/testingpeers. Thank you for listening, and we'll welcome you back for our next episode in a couple of weeks.
For now, it's goodbye from the testing peers.
Goodbye.